Okay, why don't I start the intros? We're so happy to have Adam Rosenberg here to present his work on firearm regulation. Um, as usual, panelists should feel free to jump in at any point. Um, Audience members, please ask questions through the Q&A feature, and we will read them aloud to the speaker as they come in. We'll try and wrap up around 1 Eastern or 10 Pacific, and if you want to stick around and ask more questions, we'll hang out for a little while.
Cool. Well, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to present at the Virtual Quant Marketing Seminar, and thanks to all of you for coming. And I'm going to be talking with you about my job market paper, Regulating Firearm Markets, Evidence from California. I'm going to get started with some facts about guns in the US. Consumers value firearms. 1 in 3 US households is a firearm owner, and consumers purchase more than $1 billion of firearms each year. And because firearms are durable goods, these purchases have long-standing implications for firearm ownership into the future. For instance, in surveys, 1 in 2 firearm owners says that they have not purchased a firearm over the past 5 years. And it's this durable allocation of firearms across US households that creates serious public health problems. Each year in the US, there are more than 100,000 firearm injuries, and 1 in 3 of these are fatal. As a result, regulators have expressed interest in designing policies for firearm markets to help trade off the value consumers get from firearm purchase against potential improvements in public health. Unfortunately for regulators, they have extremely limited evidence on which to base their policy decisions. What this looks like is that in 2024, California chose to set a sales tax on firearm purchase. And the way they chose their tax rate was by doubling a federal excise tax on firearm manufacturers set more than 100 years in the past. And there's no reason to think that this is the right way to be choosing tax rates. Moreover, regulators have a number of other more targeted policies available to them. The city of San Jose maintains a system of local taxes on firearm purchase, applicable only to residents of that city. Chicago, from 2010 to 2014, took a different tact and directly banned the operation of all firearm retailers within city limits. A number of regulators have proposed raising the minimum legal age for handgun purchase, whereas others, instead of making firearms more difficult to acquire, engage in gun buybacks where they repurchase firearms from their citizens. What all of these policies have in common is that they target a set of firearm purchases on the margin, which creates ambiguity in their effects because we know little about consumers' marginal firearm purchasing behaviors. Thinking about preferences and durability, we might ask how many firearm purchases are on the margin and what share of these are going to have implications for firearm ownership. And we get a huge array of responses. From some pointing out that 3 in 4 firearm owners say that they could never see themselves not owning a firearm, to others pointing out that during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were millions of excess first-time firearm purchasers. And thinking about externalities, we might ask whether these marginal firearm purchases, if they exist, have implications for public health downstream. And we'd get another broad array of responses. From some arguing that regulations on the legal firearm market can only harm public health, to others pointing out that the legal acquisition of a handgun correlates with subsequent public health harms inside the home. Under this backdrop of ambiguity, the research question I'm going to address in this paper is how do preferences, durability, and externalities determine the impacts of firearm policy? To answer this question, I'm going to assemble administrative data from California that records the universe of handgun purchases in the state, the operations of all firearm retailers, and the universe of fatality outcomes. Using these data, I'll document some key facts of consumers' marginal firearm purchasing behaviors. Where the margin I'll be studying is created by the entry and exit of firearm retailers within a market over time. And by marginal, I mean handgun purchases that occur that wouldn't have happened if the retailer wasn't in operation. Working in an event study design, I'll show that the entry of a firearm retailer increases consumer handgun purchasing, handgun ownership, and that the increase in handgun ownership causes a subsequent increase in homicide fatalities. In the next part of the talk, I'm going to extrapolate away from the variation created by the entry and exit of firearm retailers by building a model of consumer demand for handgun purchase in which durable handgun ownership affects fatalities downstream. The model will feature heterogeneity across consumers and the pre-existing allocation of handgun ownership in the population, heterogeneity in consumer preferences for subsequent handgun purchase, and heterogeneity in the public health impacts of an individual's handgun ownership. And allowing for these multiple dimensions of heterogeneity, I'm able to study the way that they relate to one another. And I find that consumers with a higher willingness to pay to acquire handguns are also those consumers for whom handgun ownership generates more homicide fatalities on average. And this is a source of adverse selection of consumers into handgun ownership on externality relevant characteristics. In the last part of the talk, I'm going to use this fitted model to analyze the design of counterfactual taxes and regulations for California's legal handgun market. I'll show that California's chosen 2024 tax rate approximately maximizes public revenue achievable from this market, but that it's likely set too low when further accounting for its effects on both consumer surplus and public health. And if I have time, maybe afterward, I can talk through a number of other more targeted policy regulations that I'm able to simulate through the model. Now that we know where we're going, let me briefly overview the literature and contributions. Most directly, this paper relates to a recent set of papers about firearm markets themselves. Among these, this is the first to estimate consumer demand for firearm purchase using verifiable transactions from a real-world firearms market, allowing you to employ the principle of revealed preference. And this is also the only paper that jointly estimates consumer preferences for firearm purchase alongside the public health implications of firearm ownership, allowing me to make statements about selection. Because I estimate these public health implications, I also speak to a much longer literature on firearms, public health, and the design of policy. Among these papers, I speak to a longstanding challenge in the literature, which is trying to figure out whether firearm ownership causes crime to go up or down, which has been challenging to address because of endogeneity, that guns may cause crime, but crime may cause guns. I'll have a new way to address endogeneity in my setting by using the entry and exit of firearm retailers as an instrument for firearm ownership. Most broadly, this paper relates to a classic question in economics on the design of regulation for product markets that generate externalities, especially when these externalities can be heterogeneous in the population. I'm going to dig into the structure of this heterogeneity by using tools from the analysis of selection markets to study the relationship of consumer preferences for handgun purchase with externalities from handgun ownership. And I think this is a good time to break if there's been any questions.
Yeah, Adam, Ken Wilbur asks in the comments, when you say the universe of purchases, does that include illegal or unregulated purchases or legally recorded purchases only?
Legally recorded purchases only, and in 2 slides, I'll have a lot of details about what exactly is in the data and what exactly isn't. Okay.
Sorry, Adam.
Yeah,
I
of
have a
course.
question. So you emphasize the durable nature of guns, and then also the differences between marginal and inframarginal consumers in response to attacks. I was thinking, even for non-durable goods, this distinction between marginal and inframarginal consumers matter. So I was wondering what the durability nature of guns help with the conceptual framework.
Yeah, I think of a lot of the model that I'll write down it would be similar if there wasn't durability. And durability is going to arise in the exact way I think about the structure of the externality generating function. I'll point this out when we get into the model. But I think a lot of the analysis that I'll be carrying out, you could think about with marginal and inframarginal, even for non-durable goods, maybe say cigarettes.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, moving into the setting and data, the setting is going to be California's handgun market. And it's clearest to think about what would happen if you wanted to buy a gun in California. Most consumers go to the legal handgun market, which moves about 300,000 handguns per year, with a median sale price of around $600, with striking uniformity across different firearm retailers. And about a third of buyers in this market are first-time handgun purchasers. Around 80% of legal handgun sales in California go through licensed firearm retailers. These are brick and mortar stores that run the gamut from small independents to big box retailers like Bass Pro Shops. And consumers on average travel about 20 miles one way to transact with one of these retailers. Because it's relevant to my research design, I'm briefly going to overview the regulations facing these retailers, where before selling their first firearm, they have to, in serial, find a location from which to conduct business and undergo all their standard local business permitting. Once their local permits are in place, they go to the federal government and apply for a federal license to conduct commerce in arms. And once the federal license comes in, they go to the state of California for an analogous licensing. And it's only after that last license comes in that they're allowed to sell their first handgun. I observe around 1,000 of these retailers in my data and around 500 entries during my sample. Now, not all, yes, please.
Adam, I have a quick question. Are you also considering online purchases as well in this?
Yeah, that thought for just a couple moments, I'll speak to online
Okay.
purchases. So there's other ways to legally acquire a handgun in California. You can buy directly from an individual on the peer-to-peer market. You can go to a gun show, buy online, or even have a gun custom smithed. But what's unique about California is that no matter the sales channel, all these handgun transactions face a uniform set of reporting regulations in order to qualify as legal. So anytime a handgun is transferred in California, the buyer, seller, and firearm need to be physically present at one of these licensed firearm retailers who records information about the transaction on a state-mandated form. And they'll send this form in to California's Department of Justice. And the key data for my project is just going to be a digitized record of all of these handgun transfer forms. Once this and other reporting regulations are met, then you'd be able to legally acquire a handgun. Now, not all handgun acquisitions in California are legal, and there's a fringe of illicit transactions. And because of the illegality, we have much poorer quality information about this segment of the market. But what we do know through interviewing market participants is that illegality creates transaction costs, which you can think of as arising through counterparty risk. And this leads to prices on the illegal market that are 3 times higher than what's available legally, and for 40% of attempted illegal market transactions to simply fail. And that means for consumers with access to both market segments, they're not going to look like close substitutes. No matter the sales channel, handgun acquisitions have implications for public health and crime downstream. There's around 9,000 shootings per year in California, with a mean time to crime of around 3 years. That means when you look at guns recovered in crime scenes, on average, it's been about 3 years since their last legal point of sale. And half of these recovered crime guns are found within 10 miles of the last legal purchaser, and half of gun homicides in California are committed by the handgun's legal owner. And this means that the external public health implications of handgun ownership occur over short terms and are locally bunched and relevant to the legal purchases. This is also a good time to pause for institutional details if there are questions.
I was thinking that one way that you could also increase handgun ownership in California is through migration, given that sales are not that high. What happens if you migrate?
Is this like traveling somewhere else to purchase?
No, like if I move from Nevada to California and I owned a handgun legally in Nevada, now what?
You have to, in that case, you have to go to one of these licensed retailers and register your firearms on the same form.
So migration would show up in your data.
Migration would show up in my data.
So Adam, in the illegal market, given the very high price and then the difficulties, then people really are willing to get spending so much effort. I guess the crime proportion is not the same as the legal market.
That's right. We don't know the denominator for the illegal market, but it's safe to say that there's a big tranche of firearm injuries and crime that is committed with illegally acquired firearms. So that's where this half of recovered firearms at homicide scenes are committed by the firearms legal owner. And that number is actually higher when you look at non-fatal violent assault with a firearm. That's around 60 to 70%. But for other types of crime, especially property crime that might be more remunerative to the criminal, there the rate committed with legal firearms is much lower, and that's more of where the illegal firearms seem to be a key input to the crime production function.
We can get to this later, but when you do all your counterfactuals, what's assumed of that market? Like if the tax rate is suddenly so much higher, do people migrate over to the outside option?
Yeah, all my counterfactuals are going to study the legal market. And the way I think about this is that for moderately sized changes in the tax, I wouldn't expect large substitution from the legal to illegal market because there's already this 3x wedge in price. But it's going to be a much harder pill to swallow when we think about much larger counterfactual changes in the price. And that's going to be a limitation of the paper, and I'll point that out when I speak to the counterfactuals. Okay, so getting more into the specifics of what's in my data, the key data set for analysis will record consumer handgun purchasing and firearm retailer operations. These are detailed transaction-level records with panel identifiers for consumers and retailers, their precise geographic locations, as well as additional characteristics like consumer demographics. Over a pre-period, I'll be able to observe the panel identifiers, but not locations, and so I'll use this to estimate pre-existing handgun ownership in the population. And over the later period, where I observe both the identifiers and locations, will be my sample for estimation and counterfactuals. Although these are great data on transaction quantities, they have a key limitation, which is that they don't record transaction prices. And that's going to lead me to use distance traveled as opposed to price paid as a key metric through a lot of my analysis. And I'll talk about this in the model when it becomes relevant. In addition to these handgun transfer records, I'm also going to use additional information on fatalities taken from California's morgue records from their Department of Public Health, as well as standard aggregate sources of information on crime demographics, voting, wages, and income. Using these data, I'm now going to document some key facts of consumers' marginal firearm purchasing behaviors. Where the first fact I want to show is that there's many handgun purchases on the margin. To show this, I'm going to estimate an event study in handgun purchasing around a set of clean first entries of firearm retailers. So I'm going to look at zip codes that go from having no operational firearm retailers to one retailer. And by clean, I just mean that there's exactly one entry during this period. There's no corresponding exit of the firearm retailer, and the entry isn't too close to either end of my sample. So on the left-hand side of this regression is handgun purchases per capita in zip code Z during 6-month interval T, where I'm using 6-month intervals to help increase finite sample power. And on the right-hand side are a set of event study indicators from 3 years before to after a firearm retailer's entry. The parameters of interest are going to be beta, which captures the average change in consumer handgun purchasing per period in a zip code period. That's exactly T prime periods from one of these clean first entries. And the way I'm going to estimate these parameters is by comparing handgun purchasing per capita in zip code periods after the entry of one of these firearm retailers to other zip code periods that are going to experience an entry within 3 years, but where the entry hasn't happened yet. as well as to a set of pure controls that never have any operational firearm retailers during my sample. Fitting this model, we can look at the effect of a firearm retailer coming into operation on consumer handgun purchasing. So on the horizontal axis is years since a firearm retailer enters, and on the vertical axis is the change in consumer handgun purchases. Although I estimate the model using purchases per capita, I've scaled everything here by California's average zip code population, so we can interpret the numbers as what would happen if the average clean first entry occurred in California's average zip code. And to be really clear about the variable that I'm studying here, this is going to be handgun purchases by consumers in the entered zip code at any firearm retailer operating in California. And that's going to be the market expansion effect of retailer entry, because these are additional handgun purchases occurring on the margin that wouldn't have happened if the retailer wasn't in operation. Now, to interpret this as a market expansion effect, we're going to need a key assumption, which is that retailers are not systematically timing or positioning their operational decisions on the residual handgun purchasing shocks, XC. Of course, we wouldn't expect retailers to be entering and exiting purely randomly in California. And that's really where these decisions around controlling for high resolution fixed effects by zip code and quarter, as well as making comparisons in a systematic way between just after entry and just before entry come into play. Because I'm going to be able to soak up a lot of the things that might lead a retailer to come into operation by conditioning on these variables. And for example, in the online appendix of the paper, I show that it's possible to predict where firearm retailers are operating based off of levels and trends in political participation, political views, income, population, but that all of these variables lose their explanatory power after conditioning on these higher resolution fixed effects.
Sorry, I just have a quick clarification. I might have missed it from the data description, but are we talking like all different types of retailer entrants, or like a specific, just like the big chains and not the like the one person shop entrant?
Yeah, this is going to have both big chains and also mom and pops. There's more, you can see there's 71 events here. About 3/4 of that is going to be coming from mom and pop type retailers. Now, for those familiar with the setting, there's also some very small scale federal firearms licensees. So these are people who have undergone all of the licensing, but they're not really a retailer in a traditional sense. They're licensed to their home and they have the license just for personal buying and selling use. And so it's not a store that you could go and visit in a traditional sense. And I'm excluding those types of FFLs from the analysis.
Related to that question, why do you study the first entry of retailers? I'm imagining the relationship would be nonlinear. So when you try to generalize the effect, how do you think about it? I would think the first entry would have a very large effect on the purchases.
Yeah, and in fact, it does. Hold that thought about first entrants versus incumbents, and I'll speak to that in a little bit. Okay, so what we're looking at here again is the change in overall handgun purchasing, the market expansion effect of retailer entry across the full set of retailers, and full set of clean first entries in my data. But we can also learn more by looking just at handgun purchasing by the entering retailer. And that's what I'm showing you here in blue. Where, for example, during the first year post-entry, so that'd be the sum of periods 1 and 1.5, the entrant would increase the market by about 100 handgun purchases, but they would sell 120 handguns over the same time period. And that's possible because the entrant also generates a business stealing effect through the reallocation of inframarginal handgun purchases from incumbent retailers elsewhere in the city. And although first entrants generate both market expansion and business stealing, it's the market expansion effect that dominates. And this market expansion effect is economically meaningful, representing a 30% increase in total handgun purchasing relative to California's average zip code period. Now, I'm able to push this set of results in a number of different directions. So I show that the first entry of a firearm retailer has larger effects on consumers living in the entered zip code than on consumers who live in zip codes more distant from the entrant. I also show that first entrants generate more market expansion and less business stealing than do entrants into zip codes with at least one pre-existing incumbent retailer. And I find a oppositely signed effect of retailer exit, which leads to a market contraction in handgun purchasing. Now, using the resolution of the data, I'm also able to look at the types of consumers responding on the margin to retailer entries. Where what I'm showing you here is that there's the same 30% increase in overall handgun purchasing, both for repeat handgun buyers who account for most of the quantity in the market, but also for first-time handgun purchasers who are new to handgun ownership. And this means consumers are adjusting both on the intensive margin of how many handguns they own, but also on the extensive margin of whether or not they own a handgun at all. And here we have a jump in the flow of first-time handgun purchases, which generates a kink in the growth of the handgun ownership stock each period post-entry. And this growing stock of handgun owners aligns with the timing of an increase in homicide fatalities. And this is going to be the key evidence I'm presenting that handgun ownership causes homicides. Now, looking at the right-hand side of the figure, you'll see that the confidence intervals are quite wide. And that's because, as was mentioned earlier, I'm really zoomed in on a narrow set of clean first entries around a very specific set of zip codes and events. And so my preferred approach for estimating the causal effect of handgun ownership on homicides is going to use the full set of zip code quarters in California and the full set of entry and exit events in my data. And the way I do that is by running a regression of fatalities per capita in zip code Z during quarter T on the contemporaneous level of handgun ownership per capita, where the parameter of interest mu is going to capture the average change in fatalities from adding one new handgun owner on the margin. Now, of course, we would expect handgun ownership to be endogenous, and I'm going to use an instrument for handgun ownership as the count of firearm retailers operating contemporaneously in a zip code quarter. And because this regression conditions on zip code fixed effects, the identifying variation is going to come from the timing of retailers' entries and exits within a zip code over time, exactly analogous to the event studies I was showing you earlier. And these regressions have very similar properties to the more narrowly tailored event studies, where if in that first stage I put handgun purchasing on the left-hand side, I get exactly the same market expansion effects as I was showing you earlier. And the timing of entries and exits in this broader sample is also conditionally uncorrelated with lagged measures of homicides and handgun purchasing.
Adam, so you're considering fatalities in the same zip code and same quarter, so it's very local. Do we have an understanding of what kind of fatality it is? If it's like home violence, maybe it's the same zip code, but do you have a decomposition of what kind of fatalities you're looking at?
Yeah, I'll show results separately for homicide and suicide fatalities with and without a firearm. I'm not going to dig into the types of consumers who are injured through handgun ownership, but I'll have a lot to say about the types of consumers who own handguns. Part of that is a decision on my part. When we think about the design of counterfactual regulations, I'm really going to think a lot about the potential for positive or negative externalities from handgun ownership that could be, say, from an individual and they prevent another type of person from being harmed through their handgun ownership. And so I'm going to try to take a more maximalist view of the types of incidents that could be responding on the margin. So fitting this regression via two-stage least squares, we can look at the effect of adding, say, 100 handgun owners on fatalities in a zip code quarter. So this will be 100 times the parameter mu, and these 100 additional handgun owners would represent a little bit more than a 10% increase in zip code quarter handgun ownership. And looking, for instance, at firearm-related homicide fatalities, adding 100 handgun owners, we would expect homicide fatalities to increase by 0.04 per zip code quarter. And that also represents a little bit more than a 10% increase relative to average. We can also look not just at homicide fatalities, but at all-cause fatality, or excuse me, not just at firearm-related homicides, but at all-cause homicides, where we see that almost the entire effect is driven by these changes in firearm-related incidents on the margin. And that makes sense because we're specifically studying changes in firearm ownership. And in the online appendix, I have a set of placebo tests where I show that these changes in handgun ownership don't drive things we wouldn't expect them to, like pneumonia or skin cancer fatalities. We see similar patterns for suicide-related incidents, but with more statistical uncertainty and smaller absolute magnitudes. And all of these results are robust to various specifications of the instrument and explanatory variables designed to capture different components of handgun ownership on downstream fatalities.
Adam, I'm going to ask you a question from the audience, again from Ken. He basically suggests that other crime outcomes would be interesting to consider here to think whether you can have any deterrence effect of ownership. Like, I'm guessing he's thinking property crime, etc.
Absolutely. So I haven't been able to get really high resolution information about non-fatal incidents using a very similar design, just aggregating up to county level variation, where I'm able to use standard FBI data products. I show that handgun ownership leads also to an increase in non-fatal violent crime, but a potential slight decrease in property crime. Now, both of these are estimated with much more error because I'm using more aggregate data and it's hard to move this local variation up to the more aggregate level. But I would say that there's potential deterrence of property crime and a potential exacerbation of non-fatal violent crime.
Adam, can I ask a question about, sort of, have you computed the implied elasticity to distance or the sort of the transportation cost? It seems like a gun is $600 and only willing to buy it if there's a very local option available. Seems to suggest a very high transportation cost.
Yeah. So here it becomes notable that the way handgun purchasing works in California, and remember, consumers travel on average 20 miles one way to purchase, is that typically you'd have to make that one-way trip twice there and back. But there's also a 10-day waiting period between gun purchase and gun pickup. So you have to make that round trip twice, once to buy and once to acquire. And so then it becomes an 80-mile on average trip. And I think the difference between 80 miles and just being within your zip code is quite meaningful. In the model, I allow for a lot of heterogeneity and disutility from travel distance, allowing it to differ by demographics, by where individuals live, and geographic characteristics, as well as county fixed effects. And I find a considerable amount of heterogeneity and disutility from travel. I don't remember offhand exactly where to, I think around adding 10 miles of travel distance would be akin to allowing a discount on the average gun price of around 15 to 20%. So they're very much in the same ballpark.
Yeah, thanks.
So in addition to looking at fatalities in aggregate, I'm also able to use the resolution of the data to look at the types of consumers for whom handgun ownership generates more versus fewer fatalities on the margin. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to describe the identifying variation and the results, but all the details are in the paper. And so the way I'm going to get identification here comes from the fact that there's a lot of heterogeneity across different areas within California. And that means when entries and exits occur in different parts of the state, they put different types of consumers at risk of becoming a handgun owner. And I'm able to correlate this variation in both the level and composition of handgun ownership with variation across entry and exit events and their effect on homicide fatalities downstream. And leveraging this type of variation, I show that the types of consumers for whom handgun ownership generates more costly homicide fatalities tend to be younger, white, and male, as well as geographically living in areas that are lower income, higher crime, and more rural. And so not only is there heterogeneity in the effect of handgun ownership on fatalities in the population, and not only does handgun ownership cause homicides, but the effect of handgun ownership on homicides follows systematic patterns of heterogeneity in the population. And in the next part of the talk, I'm going to use a model to dig further into the structure of this heterogeneity. But before that, let me pause again for questions.
Wait, sorry, you can go ahead, or should I go first? Okay.
Jessica go
Oh,
first.
sorry. Okay. I was curious, do you also have from the dealer record of sales data, the type of handgun, like, because I know like there's different conversation around, maybe semi-automatic pistol should be banned in particular, and like if you've looked at those particular types of handguns and how they relate to fatality. And then also along the lines of that, like, are you also considering the used gun market? Like, does this transfer data also consider, because I think with that, you can think of like how you think of price with the same make and model, there can still be various prices. So I'm just curious how you consider all of that in your framework.
Yeah, for the used gun market, my data do contain used firearms, and I do not think about price differentiation between new and used. And in the model, I'm going to assume that there's just one good called a handgun. So that's a definite limitation of the framework. To your first question about heterogeneity in the type of firearm, and can I link that to downstream harms? In another project, I've done a lot of work trying to look into that specific question, and it's been very hard to get answers. In part, that's because the data on fatalities, fortunately, they're somewhat rare, and so it's quite hard to correlate it with narrow changes in the composition of the stock of firearms. There's some really interesting work pointing out that when an individual is shot by a higher caliber bullet, they're more likely to die, but the use of higher caliber weapons doesn't correlate with any other characteristics of the incident. So that's maybe pointing out that the characteristics themselves do drive fatalities. However, larger caliber firearms can be harder to aim, and so from an ex-ante perspective, it's hard to know which of them is more damaging overall.
Adam, so for the results that you were just showing about heterogeneity, is that because that can be decomposed into higher purchases, or how purchases lead to fatality? So can I think about as like a combination of two effects?
No, those are for adding an additional handgun to the average marginal purchaser, what is the effect on homicide fatalities? Holding fixed the purchasing channel.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so moving into the model, the purpose of the model.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Jennings, which is if this is just conditional on purchase, the marginal effects on fatalities, like are those demographic groups also buying more guns? Or I mean, guns are expensive, low income, young people are maybe less likely to buy. So
yeah, so it's going to be The way the estimator works is it adjusts for changes within each group on handgun purchasing, and then imposes a model of treatment effect heterogeneity by these different observable characteristics to make sense of how levels of handgun ownership within these groups created by entry and exit variation correlates with homicide fatalities downstream. But I totally agree that there's different preferences within these observable characteristics. And part of what the model allows me to do is exactly capture that even conditional on observables, there might be consumers who both like versus dislike purchasing a firearm, and that can be correlated with their preferences for purchase. So moving into the model, the purpose of the model is to dig into the structure of heterogeneity in this setting and allow me to use it to think about counterfactual regulations on the firearm market. The model is going to have two components. First will be a specification of consumer preferences for handgun purchase from firearm retailers, where they can choose to purchase from retailers operating in most places in the state. Consumers are going to make a sequence of repeated static choices for handgun purchase over time, and this will give rise to a time-varying allocation of handgun ownership in the population. And the second piece of the model will be a mapping from the allocation of handgun ownership to the occurrence of fatalities downstream. And this mapping will account for both observed and unobservable characteristics of an individual that can be potentially correlated with their preferences. In specifying the model, I'll include all the pieces we need to think about counterfactual regulations, even though not all of these components will be directly observable in data. For instance, you'll recall that I don't get to observe the prices at which firearms transact. And that's going to lead me to specify an estimator for my model that allows me to recover the full set of primitives, even facing these unobservables. Moving into the structure of the model, I'm going to start out by writing down consumer preferences for handgun purchase from firearm retailers and the way this gives rise to handgun ownership. So we'll have consumer I in demographic group X during calendar quarter T, making a decision of whether or not to purchase a handgun, where again, all handguns are assumed undifferentiated in the model. Consumers can choose to purchase this handgun from firearm retailers J, or choose not to purchase, which is selecting the outside option. The choice set of firearm retailers, big J, varies across consumer zip codes to capturing all firearm retailers in operation within 200 miles of the individual, and varies over time to accommodate retailer entry and exit. Indirect utility for consumer I of transacting at retailer J during period T depends on two components. First is an extensive margin piece, which shifts the value of purchasing versus not purchasing a handgun. And the second is a retailer choice component, which shifts the value of purchasing from different firearm retailers. Looking first at this extensive margin component, consumers will have a present value of handgun purchase, new I. And this depends on high-resolution fixed effects by demographic and zip code, a shifter for pre-existing handgun ownership prior to 2005 to accommodate the possibility that these long-standing handgun owners behave differently from other consumers in the market, as well as an unobservable preference, new tilde, assumed normally distributed in the population with demographic-specific standard deviation. In addition to these time-invariant present values, there's also going to be a time-varying preference component. This includes the tax-inclusive price of a firearm, PT. Again, this is assumed homogeneous in the model, which consumers dislike purchasing based off of the price coefficient alpha P. And the last component of the extensive margin preference will be a demand shock C, varying in high resolution across demographic, zip code, and quarter. I'll pause for questions.
Yeah. Could the consumers also care about the expected fatality rate in their zip code in expectation, for example, since all the crimes are committed so locally?
They could care about the expected fatality rate, and that would show up in the model through the demand shocks. What I'm going to shut down is the possibility that consumers are going to care about their specific change And actually, consumers could care about their change in the homicide rate through the epsilons, but I'm going to be shutting down any type of dynamics where, say, I buy a gun and then crime goes down and then people buy more because they know that crime's going down in some way. Part of this is informed by the event studies, where you'll recall that the change in handgun purchasing it was flat and then it jumped and then stayed flat again. If we lived in a world where this type of peer effects or forward-looking expectations were important, we might expect, say, that when I buy a gun and handgun and crime starts going down, if you start caring about the way that my purchase affects future crime, we would get a concave pattern of treatment effect heterogeneity over time because you'd be free riding off of the protection services provided by my handgun. And because I didn't observe that type of convexity or concavity, that's going to be my reason for assuming away these types of pure effects and cycles. So turning now to the retailer choice component, retailers are going to be differentiated in 2 dimensions. There'll be a retailer vertical quality, delta J, which consumers value, but they dislike traveling to more distant retailers based off of the distance coefficient, alpha D. And this is parameterized at the same level as the price coefficient. The last component of the model will be nested logit shocks for firearm retailers, where the nesting is separates the retailers from the outside option of choosing to not purchase a handgun. So this is how consumers choose, but because they make this sequence of choices over time, that gives rise to a law of motion for individual handgun ownership. Where to own a gun in period T, consumer I could either have owned in the prior period or not owned and chosen to purchase. So this is where handguns come from. And now let me tell you about their role in determining fatalities downstream. Fatalities in the model are going to arise from 2 sources. First will be fatalities arising from externalities of legal handgun ownership. And there will be other sources of fatalities that enter additively separably. Focusing first on these externalities, they're going to enter as the average externality characteristics among all the legal handgun owners in a zip code quarter. And it's possible that any individual's externality could be positive or negative to accommodate either prevention or exacerbation of fatalities through an individual's handgun ownership. I'm going to place additional structure on the externality function, assuming it follows a linear specification in the population, where there'll be an externality intercept, mu, as well as a vector of externality slopes, zeta. The first set of these slopes will interact with consumers' observable characteristics in exactly the same way as in the descriptive analysis of heterogeneity from the first part of the talk. And the second set of this vector, zeta v, is going to interact with the same set of characteristics that determine a consumer's present value of handgun purchase. And the upshot of this assumption is that heterogeneity in these slopes means that consumers can be selected into handgun ownership on the basis of characteristics that determine their preferences for handgun purchase, even conditional on their observable demographic variables. I'll also mention that in the special case of no heterogeneity, where we zero out this zeta vector, this model just collapses back to the homogeneous effect of handgun ownership on homicide fatalities that we were studying in the descriptive part of the talk. Turning now to these other sources, omega, I'm going to assume that they follow a 2-way fixed effect specification, again, similar to the descriptive component of the talk, but with 2 sources of structural errors. The first is going to accommodate endogeneity between fatalities and consumer demand. And I'm going to accommodate this by directly placing the high resolution demand shocks, the X's, into the model with a coefficient. And the way to interpret this coefficient chi is that the higher is chi, then the more likely that a zip code quarter with high fatalities per capita is also a zip code quarter in which consumers have high unobserved demand for handguns. And the last piece of the model will be a pure residual, assumed mean zero and independent from the other regressors. So this is the model. Now let me briefly tell you about estimation. I'm going to estimate the model using an exactly identified minimum distance procedure, taking advantage both of the first order conditions of the log likelihood of consumers' handgun purchasing, but also asking the model to match other moments of the data. For instance, to estimate the nesting parameter, I'm going to ask the model to exactly reproduce the event study effects of retailer entry on handgun purchasing. And this makes sense because the nesting parameter sort of governs the elasticity of substitution across the extensive margin of handgun purchase. I'm going to estimate this value by using the way I observe consumers substituting across the extensive margin in response to the entry of a first firearm retailer into their zip code. For the fatality specification, I'm going to use the fact that the fatality errors are orthogonal to the other regressors after conditioning on these estimated demand shocks. And this leads to a control function style approach with identification coming from the entry and exit of firearm retailers. You'll recall that there are two sources of systematic variation and preferences for handgun purchase over time. The first being these demand shocks, and the second being the entry and exit of firearm retailers from consumers' choice sets. So once we've conditioned on the shocks, the only remaining source of variation is entry and exit, which serves to identify the externality parameters. Once we have all of this material in place, we're able to use the model to think about the distribution of preferences and externalities among consumers in California after we have a way to value the disparate effects of firearm regulation on society. I'll measure consumer surplus in the typical way for logit models. For public health, I'll value each homicide that doesn't occur using a fiscal cost of a homicide fatality as an extreme conservative benchmark. So this is meant to include things like using law enforcement resources to investigate or sending in paramedics, but is meant to exclude things like lost future wages and societal well-being. So I really think of this as an extreme lower bound on the cost of a fatality. And last, for government expenditure, I'll value $1 of tax revenue at $1 of welfare, using the idea that handguns retail at around $600 with a status quo sales tax in California of around 9%. So with all this machinery in place, on the horizontal axis of this figure, what I'm showing you is private surplus from handgun purchase in California's average quarter. And on the vertical axis are externalities created as a handgun owner. And I'm going to, in this space, show you the distribution of consumers across all of California. A key meridian in this space is going to be the vertical axis, which separates consumers with a positive value of handgun purchase from consumers we would expect not to buy a handgun with a negative willingness to pay. A second key meridian is going to be a downward sloping line with slope of -1 and intercept equal to the value of tax revenue produced by an average handgun sale. So consumers above this frontier are going to have a value of consumer surplus, externalities, and tax revenue greater than 0, and would serve to increase social welfare through the handgun purchase, whereas consumers below would decrease welfare by purchasing. And the intersection of these lines will speak to allocative efficiency in the market. For instance, the lower right quadrant captures consumers who we would expect to purchase a handgun, but for whom handgun purchase would decrease net social welfare. And using the model, we can locate all of California's consumers in this two-dimensional space, where I've also added the conditional expectation function, which shows at each point in the willingness to pay distribution, the average externalities among all consumers at that willingness to pay. Now, it's somewhat hard to see where the data is because there's 28 million points in this figure. So I've also added the interquartile range and the 90-10 percentiles. And you can see that there's, in general, a downward slope to the data. And that's a sign of adverse selection, because consumers with a higher willingness to pay to acquire a handgun are also those consumers for whom handgun ownership generates more costly homicide fatalities. In fact, this adverse selection is so strong that at each point in the willingness to pay distribution, the average consumer in general generates a net negative social welfare through their handgun purchase. And I think of this adverse selection result as being really the key feature delivered by the model. In the last part of the talk, I'm going to use this fitted model to think about the design of counterfactual firearm regulations. I'm going to start off by thinking about what's feasible by changing the aggregate handgun sales tax in California from the status quo up to higher and higher rates. So the left hand of this figure will be the additional tax. The horizontal axis will be the change in $1 million per year, either in tax revenue or consumer surplus. And the right axis will be the change in homicide quantities per year, with the status quo in the top right at 0, 0, 0. And using the model, we can simulate the effects of California's 2024 tax. That's about $66 per handgun, finding that it would destroy $7 million of consumer surplus each year, add $1 million of tax revenue each year, and prevent around 400 yearly homicides. And using this calibrated fiscal cost of a homicide fatality, this looks like sound fiscal policy. We can understand where this result came from by going back to the structure of the model. Increasing the tax by $66 does two things. It shifts the vertical axis $66 to the right because each handgun now costs $66 more. But it also shifts down the welfare frontier by $66 because each handgun purchase now generates $66 more tax revenue. And these two shifts partition the population of consumers into marginals who buy under the status quo, but not at the higher tax, as well as inframarginals who buy under both regimes. But we can use the structure of the model to learn even more by decomposing the types of consumers responding on the margin. So because marginal consumers stopped purchasing and all of them were paying a constant tax prior to the increase, that generates a homogeneous loss tax rectangle across the set of consumers. However, because we're distorting these consumers' privately optimal decisions, there's a further drop in consumer surplus above and beyond the lost taxes, and the cost of consumer surplus lost grows with the value consumers would have gotten for handgun purchase under the status quo. But because we've distorted these consumers' decisions, there's a further change in externalities created by the now fewer handgun owners in the population. This is given by the bottom externality gain region, which is bounded below by the population conditional expectation function. And among inframarginals, there's a pure transfer of surplus from consumers to the government in the form of higher taxes paid. And we can think about the welfare effects of a tax by aggregating up the population of consumers in each of these regions, averaging them over the different years in California, and plotting those averages in this space. And repeating this process at lots of different counterfactual taxes allows us to trace out the frontiers of what's possible through different taxes in California. One thing to note here is that California's chosen tax in 2024 approximately maximizes this Laffer curve in tax revenue, meaning that it comes very close to fully maximizing public revenues achievable from the market. And that's surprising because California's chosen tax actually ended up optimizing a well-defined policy objective, even though they picked it by doubling a federal excise tax set 100 years in the past. But we could think about re-optimizing by changing the tax when also accounting for its effects on consumer surplus and public health. And this leads to a cost of homicide fatalities high enough to essentially shut down the legal market with an optimized tax. And that's because of adverse selection. Anytime the regulator increases the tax on handgun purchase, they leave behind a residual pool of handgun buyers with above average externality costs. And this pushes up the optimal tax rate and leads the regulator to want to set a tax high enough to unravel the market for legal handguns. I believe I'm at time, so I'm going to wrap up here by saying that in this paper, I ask the research question, how do preferences, durability, and externalities determine the impacts of firearm policy? To answer this question, I assemble administrative data from California, which I use to document that marginal handgun purchases have welfare consequences. And I do this in a sort of descriptive event study framework. I then extrapolate away from variation created by retailer entry and exits by building a model of consumer handgun demand and its effect on fatalities. And a key feature revealed by this model is that there's adverse selection of consumers into legal handgun ownership. I use the model to simulate a number of counterfactual firearm regulations, including finding out that California's 2024 tax maximizes public revenues, but is likely set too low when further accounting for consumer surplus and public health. And in the paper, I go into some detail about other potentially more feasible targeted regulations that could be beneficial both for consumers and the government. I want to close just by noting that it's important to understand how to design these state-level firearm taxes, because 8 other states aside from California are now experimenting with firearm tax regulations. And so we want to know how to design these policies in practice. And if we were to instead think about scaling up to the national level, there'd be a whole host of other considerations, including the fact that firearm manufacturers have market power, which I consider in a companion paper with my co-author, Louis Sommer. Thank you all so much for your attention and for the invitation to present.